All right, hey, my name is James. Welcome to the presentation of the Triune. This is the main portion or the main part of unity theory that needs to be understood to encapsulate the entire theory. So we're going to head straight in and look at this chart, which is right here. All right. So ultimately, the let's go back. Where is it? There it is. So the theory of everything that would really encapsulate everything would necessarily have to have a semantic definition. So, um, language is the limitation, but there is the possibility of explaining everything as far as we can. So, the possibility of explaining through language everything, that possibility exists. So, right, by definition, how far can we get? What is the utmost, you know, explanation that is possible? Um, Theories of everything ultimately attempt to attain that possibility and actualize it. And at the very roots or at the bottom of unity theory, you will see that there is something that is unanswerable, precisely because language is limited, but also because we are limited. So even if we had a higher form of language, it wouldn't be encapsulated. It wouldn't encapsulate anything. That's why meditation is usually the ultimate realization of everything. It's why people tend to become spiritual. And once you've realized everything, then you sort of can be free to move on with your life and achieve meaning and purpose. However, there is a very important distinction between understanding and knowing, and we'll discuss that near the end of the presentation. So we'll start here. Like I said, there's a translation. So first we need to define things, and then we can translate them. The whole reason, well, the way the human mind functions is through duality, and what that means is it allows us to create contrast between things so we can see them better. This is why in this chart, although it is a triune, meaning it is a three-component thing, it requires a duality within the chart to be able to understand truth. So, as the observer, as someone who's looking at the triune, you need to understand something about yourself. The very first thing is here. So, as the observer, you'll usually fall on one of these, on the other, on one side of this triune. So, simplicity or complexity, meaning if you believe that it requires complex system of thought or framework in order to achieve a certain truth, then you'll fall on the right side. So that's usually philosophy, science, theology, that sort of thing, mathematics. And on the other side, it's usually more spiritual, so like rituals, meditation, non-conceptuality, just simplifying everything to not to achieve the truth without by taking the shortest path possible. And it's possible as the individual. But if your goal is to explain it or to put it into words or to help others get close to it so that they can therefore or thereafter practice the realizing the truth, then it can be done. So you can fall on either side. And of course, in the middle, it would be the actual truth. In terms of looking at this chart, the actual truth is it requires a balance between simplicity and complexity. So this chart, that's what it does. It tries to simplify everything as much as possible, but there will be a certain amount of complexity, which is why I'm here describing it to you. All right. Then we can look at the key. So the key is ultimately understanding the connection or the superposition between axiom and paradox. So an axiom is ultimately static, stable. It is the base for something. It's not truth necessarily. That's why it's on the left side. But it is a base. It is a static thing around which other things revolve. And on the right, you have paradox, which is usually an experience in human consciousness that has to do with a contradiction or some kind of disconnect or a lack of a piece of information. So it is really just duality in a way, but that's connected in a way that we can't understand. And ultimately, it can lead to understanding axioms or to realizing axioms. But ultimately, both are false or both are limited, and you ultimately need truth. And to do truth, well, it's the superposition of both axiom and paradox. So that is really going beyond what the human mind can do. We can tinker with paradoxes, we can resolve them, we can find axioms through them or through other means of logical reasoning, but ultimately the truth is always in the middle. And then on the right we have the legends. So the legend is really it's just to explain what this red and green is throughout these inputs. So red is to show you the function and green is to show you the definition. So as I explained earlier, human beings need contrast to try to achieve a certain truth. So that's why the triune necessarily includes duality, right? The base of the triangle here has two corners, and that points to the third. So these are the two corners of the triune or of the triangle, and they help you, or they help point to the middle, to this one up here. So within each input, you you also need a duality. That's why it's not just two columns. It's within each column, there's two aspects. So, for example, if you look at I is the function of an identity, right? We've defined the I, which is the actual thing we're trying to point at, with the name identity. So the logos, or the word, or language in a way, is the green, and then what we're trying to describe is the red. And of course, we're describing it with language again, and that's why it's limited. But this is the duality that we have to work with. That being said, we can start to dive into the triune here. Um, Zero is the neutral. That is the shortest way to explain or to refer to truth, absolute reality, infinity, nothingness, whatever. All of these words are quite interchangeable. God. Um, but really, these words are still limited in the sense that they don't point to the idea of Tao and Pleroma, which is what I have up here. So Tao and Pleroma, it goes beyond infinity, God, all of these other terms. And so it's another piece of language that we give it, the highest absolute truth is something that cannot be named, which is why in Taoism we call it the way. That's what Tao means. So the way is not the way if it is called the way. That's what they say. I might be misquoting that, but ultimately I think it's clear enough. You can't use a piece of language to describe the absolute piece of, or the absolute fundamental reality. That's all that means. And the pleroma is the Gnostic version of that. Ancient Greeks, really, really early Christianity and sects of esoteric groups and that kind of thing. They achieved that idea with the pleroma. So, we have this up here, but ultimately we're talking about absolute fundamental reality, whatever that is. And that's what we're going to discover through the triune here. Okay, so the triune is meant to leverage you out of dualistic vision. And so if you pay attention to one side or the other, that's what sort of generates a reality that is inaccurate. And so if you want to return to center, return to the truth, you necessarily have to combine both sides in a superposition. Now, when you do that, you ultimately realize that the zero, the absolute truth, is the superposition, right? So it's not that these two are superimposed onto each other, it's that they are this. And we just split the zero into two so that we can understand reality in a way, kind of like what God does, if you will. So I'm going to use some religious language, I'm going to use some scientific language, and the whole reason for that, try to not allow the emotional impulse or reaction to cloud your attention when I use these words. The whole point of a unifying theory is to combine or to reconcile everything, meaning science, religion, philosophy, and that's why I have here the definition of, like, the translation into philosophical language, religious language, scientific language. That being said, the triune is something that helps us achieve that, and so this is why up top here I'm using the religious language, because science is really new relatively, and it's only been around 500 years, arguably, in a way. Um, Scientific language, well, the method has been around for thousands, maybe around. Ibn al-Haytham was the first to really kind of put together a comprehensive model of the scientific method, which is over 1,000 years ago. But the point is, modern science is 500 years around there, 600 years, something like that. And so this is why I'm leaving out the scientific method, but ultimately, Holy Trinity in a way in Christianity, so that represents Western religion, the Judeo-Christian religions, which is the most popular on the planet combined. And then Trimurti is the closest thing to the in the East, to like the closest, the same idea of a trinity, of a triune. Trimurti is the three gods in Hinduism, um, and and of course the middle god. So there's two faces, and then the face looking forward is that ultimate truth. Um, so then you're going to see here there's some scientific findings or axioms that support or are exactly aligned with the religious texts, because religion and meditation, what people don't think, they don't think of it as the ancients did. It is a technology as well. It is a probing into the truth of reality. So really they're the same. Spirituality, religion, science, all this stuff, technology, it's really one thing. We're just starting to focus and hyper specialize in one thing over the other, which is what causes the decoherence, and everyone's kind of fighting over how to achieve truth instead of unifying everything and everyone's perspectives and methods so as to achieve the actual truth. And that's what unity theory does. All right, so I think I've really started to explain it quite well. So diving into the tree now, or the triune. Yeah, I still have to explain a little bit more. These on this side, these two columns are really not necessary, and in fact, all of this isn't necessary either. You could really just have these three, and they would be simple. These three pointing to the truth. But of course, when it's too simple, if you just say, yeah, the answer is zero, no one is going to really hook into that and be like, you know what, I can meditate on that and really achieve enlightenment. It's not enough. It requires a little bit of complexity to get you there. And so this is what this does. The triune ultimately will basically say, let's do it your way, kind of like in Aikido. I use your energy, and go forward with you, what your direction, and I pull you into your direction to get you to come around on the other side. So this is ultimately what this triune does. And so here, that being said, the complexity has to be explained a little bit. On this side, you have axioms, and on the other side, you have continuity. And what that means is these are just descriptions of these columns, in a way. And they're not really these columns. They're not linked to these columns. They're both relevant to the triune in a way. So axioms are the translation, the mathematical translation in a way. And it is what's going to help you visually understand how everything collapses to zero. And I'll explain that. And then continuity is the idea of infinity. So whatever axiom you find, whatever truth you find, more can be derived from it. That's why we have an infinite amount of infinities, which is what Cantor discovered. So it kind of binds everything together, which is why I call it the binding function. And it smooths out any jumps that we can make, which is, I know, a little bit abstract, but that's something that gets explained in unity theory a little bit more later. So we have the zero, which, if we return to the legend here, remember red means functions. That's what we're trying to achieve, like meaning. And we need a definition. We need to create contrast to get there. So potential is the definition that we've given to zero. Absolute potential, which really kind of gives you this idea that that ultimate reality has power, right? It is pure potential. It's undefined potential. So already that's going too far. You're describing something, and it may not be that, but that's the cleanest that we can get. So ultimately, because even the Tao, even Pleroma, like nothing, I wouldn't be speaking to you otherwise. That would be absolute truth. But being as the goal is to try to understand it a little bit more, or get as close as we can to understand it, this is why we start to define things. Okay, that being said, on either side of zero, we have positive over here and negative over here. So that's the duality already. So when you put them together, they cancel out and you have nothingness. By nothingness, we mean everythingness at the same time. That's what's amazing with the number zero. It's intrinsically linked to infinity. So it's everything and nothing at the same time, which is quite paradoxical. But ultimately, there is no paradox, there's just an actuality. Okay, so when we say that zero is everything and it is the superposition of these two, we sort of have to understand how is it the superposition, which is why on one side you have the superposition. It's almost like the qualia. So this column is the qualia of superposition of zero. Even though zero is a superposition, but we need to understand, we just pick it apart. We just take that and isolate it. And that's what axioms are. So it is really relevant. So axioms are superpositions of things. And then on the right side, we have infinity. So infinity has to do with sort of like the illusion that gets induced, right? The induction of reality. So everything that is projected outwards from separating zero or from defining things from the word. And so superpositions or axioms of truth and their resulting projection of reality and different things, matter, energy, they're ultimately, that's in the positive column. All right, so that's really all you need to know. You could stop right here and be like, cool. So if we just take all of reality and all of the axiomatic truths about reality and superpose them, you would ultimately have truth. You would not ask any more questions, and you would be enlightened. But of course, that's an experience you need to achieve. It's not enough to just understand it logically. So the logic just kind of gets you there. It's a pathway. So we'll see that, the middle column here is a pathway. So on whatever level that you play, if we go down to the biological level, if you're on this side, or you're on both sides, right? Because biology is your thing, or physics or whatever, you can just go towards the center column and then shoot upwards into zero. Because you'll see how it doesn't just collapse like horizontally upwards, how all these come from each other. So like, after this object, we have speed, velocity, we have electron. It doesn't just develop that way and collapse that way. It also develops and collapses vertically, right? Everything collapses onto itself perfectly and it reaches zero. So we're going to see that in a few moments. All right, so ultimately, what comes from zero? We start with zero, right? Being. It is a being. It is something. It's an entity. Potential is something. So we're getting a bit further away always. We're going to get further away and more imperfect. Because ultimately, zero perfectness, it wouldn't even make that distinction that it is an entity or a being. But this is what we do. So am is the function of being. Am is in a present moment. Being has nothing to do with time. And so this first axiom is something that was discovered by René Descartes 500-600 years ago, whenever that was. And it was called the cogito ergo sum, Latin for I think, therefore I am. So here it's simplified, just I am thinking. And so I am thinking, it's let's dive into it. I is the function of identity, right? So the definition of I is identity. The definition of am is being, and the definition of thinking is thought, right? So you can see how time is very relevant here at some point. It's kind of snuck in there. Then that's what we call the portion of potential. That I am, in religion. So we'll go to the translation now. The logos, as it's called, the word, it's a piece of language. I am that I am. You hear this in biblical language. It is potential. That's what it's saying. It's saying I am. It's like the zero recognizing itself and saying I am, therefore I understand that I am. So from that we project this is happening. So this is starting to get a little bit closer to the physical world that we experience, right? Like, is thought physical? No, it's super physical. But at the same time, it kind of generates a physical world through its thoughts. And so that's why we have this is happening. Because by this, we're referring to objects. Now, that object could be a thought or it could be matter, but we're not at matter yet. We're just talking about the fact that you can experience a world. So this is happening. What is happening? I am thinking. So ultimately, these first two axioms, they're self-referential, right? That's where self-reference comes in. It's a loop. So I am thinking that this is happening, and this is happening that I am thinking. All right. And ultimately, like I said, the two are one and the same, and that's why we call it a superposition. It's just that I've separated the potential and the superposition so that we can see it clearly. Right? We have 0, 1, so that's what the superposition is, 0, 1. It's both. And I've just isolated the 0, and I've isolated the 1 right after. So 0 potential is being, 1 superposition is a state, and you can already start to see the collapse, right, or the link, right? When I say this is happening, I'm referring to an object. So we define this as an object. We define is as a state, which really is the same thing as being and am, right? But it's less personal at this point. I am is personal. This is starting to project outwards. You're starting to look at something separate from yourself. Then we have happening, which implies movement. So movement is fluidity, right? Now you're talking about the quality of an object, what it's doing. It's moving, right? So happening, like time emerges out of movement. When things move in space-time, there's like a sequence. It's sequential, one event after another. My hand is here, then it's here, then it's here, and we start to experience time. But we know through filmmaking, for example, right, that it's just a series of photos that are shown in front of you, at a certain speed. The speed will come in right after, you'll see. So really, there is no time, it's just the illusion. All right, so that's the superposition. This object is state, happening, movement. Now, you'll start to notice that on the column here, we have all these infinities, right? Because ultimately, there is an infinite amount of things to describe. Like, what is happening? What is movement? I just started to describe it, right? I just said that movement is fluidity. It's photos, being shown one after the other in front of you, all this stuff. That's where the beginning of that infinity happens, right? It's an infinite amount of description and language and illusions that emerges from this one axiomatic level. All right, so when we say infinities within infinities, that's what I'm talking about. And that's what we're talking about, basically. And in the translation, we have the prime mover. That's in philosophy. We say the prime mover. Is there a prime mover? Meaning, is there something that causes everything else that itself doesn't have a cause? And that we call that a teleology as well. It's circular, basically. And in religion, we would say, I am God, right? So I am that I am. And the prime mover says, I am God, meaning I create. This is happening. I am the prime mover. That being said, we'll move to the next level. We have the 1, 2. So the reason that I have 1, 2 here, this is the beginning of infinity of all the numbers, because ultimately everything collapses to 0, or 0, 1, which is the superposition up here. You start to see that everything is nested within everything else, including the numbers. So when we say 1 and 2, 2 is actually in fact 1. And same thing here, 3, you have a superposition between 2 and 3, which means that 3 is actually 2. We have a superposition between 1 and 2, which means that 2 is actually 1. We have a superposition between 1 and 0, but because we don't have any other numbers, we say superposition, right? We have 1 is a part of the superposition and 0 is part of the superposition. And this superposition is ultimate potential. All right. So you can see how all these are nested into each other, right? 4 is 3, 3 is 2, 2 is 1, 1 is 0. So now we're on the third level, or fourth, depending on how you want to look at it. Like I said, there's a superposition, because you have here 1, 2, 3, 4. But if we want to get away from the thing that we can't describe very well, and we're going to continue not describing it, we're going to get more and more abstract, basically, as we go down. You're going to see. But you will see the link at the same time. So now we get to speed and velocity, place, position, light, photons. When we're referring to an object, the quality of this object is something that has to do with speed. When you're talking about an object, and it's going to become more clear on the row below, an electron moves. There is no like static object. Objects move at all times. And it's also where E equals mc squared came from, the idea that energy equals mass at the speed of light. So there is nothing static when it comes to physical matter. All right, so the object, the quality of the object, right, is that it has speed, but which is what velocity in science, right? Velocity and is the or speed is the function of velocity. It's a little bit kind of redundant, but there it is. It's just two pieces of language that are very simple. And then, of course, on the other side, we have light. So when we say that thought is happening, and also we have movement on this side here, like this movement and velocity, you can see they're mirror each other. This stuff is very, very abstract, very difficult to grasp, but happening implies movement. It doesn't necessarily mean speed. All right, we're just talking about happening. That's why we have that function. It's maybe a bit more clear than the definition, that something is occurring, not necessarily that has speed. Speed is just another perspective that makes things more complicated. All right, so on the other side of speed, we have light, because where does speed come from? It comes from light. The speed of light is what defines the speed for everything else. So when you start to enter the physical world, you're starting to look at relativity here. Everything is relative to each other. And so in order to have relativity, you need a limit, which is why the speed of light is limited. Nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Okay. And because we have speed, or through light, we can now create position or place. Okay. But ultimately, there is no space and no time. Everything is absolute. It's this thought that generates more and more abstraction and complexity that gets further and further away from this absolute. But ultimately, space doesn't exist. Position exists. The position, which is a fixed point, which is an absolute, which is the state of being of potential, the zero, the tau, the nothingness, the nothing that can be described. That's my girlfriend. And so now that we've described the place and position, we can see that this position doesn't refer necessarily to space the way we know it. It refers to the absolute position of the absolute. Just another qualia, right? So place is the function of a position. Again, kind of redundant. Just two different pieces of language to describe the same thing. And ultimately, you have to superpose speed and light. We already said they're connected. Light is really the measure of speed. Speed is the measure of light. Not really, but and if you put them together, we have position. We can point. We can create points in space, starting there. So the translation religiously is "Let there be light." Right? God said, "Let there be light." It's also relevant to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which basically states that you cannot measure the speed and the position of an electron at the same time. And the reason is because it does not have a position and a speed at the same time. That's all that he says. But this triune explains why. So it nests the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is correct, in a higher truth or framework. The reason that you can't measure, and again, we're just talking about speed and light, so we haven't talked about the electron itself yet, but this is the next thing that comes out, right? The quality of speed and light has to emerge first so that we can have particles, right? Why? Because light carries mass, okay? And electrons really are really just something that has speed. It's the first kind of building block of matter, right? It's starting to the building block. That's how abstract this is, or how finely tuned and accurate this is. We're really just talking about accurate inputs, very, very specific inputs, but they're all linked together, which is why it can get a little bit difficult to describe this, but it should make sense to you intuitively anyway. All right, so talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, it's relevant to energy equals mass celeritis squared, which is speed. The reason that light, which is photons, we measure it in photons. The reason that you can't measure the speed and the position, like I said, is because there's an absolute position, and space and time doesn't actually exist. So because there's an absolute position and you're creating relative positions, right, through measuring the electron right over here, the moment that you measure the electron, you're creating a point in space so that you can see that you can begin space, right? You can say, with this point in space where the electron is, I can create relativity. I can put another point anywhere else, so it's entangled particle or whatever, or its counterpart, and through these 2 points, I have created a space. But because you have these 2 points, they can't be moving away from each other. There can't be any speed, because if you do that, then you've lost the information inside or in between those 2 points. So you've lost space and time. So for space and time to emerge, the particles necessarily have to be either moving at a certain speed or have a definite position. They can't be both. And that's because there is an absolute position. All right. So speed is a function of velocity, place is a function of position, light is a function of photons. Light carries mass, and what is mass? It's built out of a proton and a neutron and an electron, right? But the proton is that generative force. That's the positive force, which is why we have in the positive column, right? It is positive charge. An electron is negative charge, so it's opposite. And a neutron is, of course, neutral. It's in the center. What allows protons and electrons to all come together. And so the function of a neutron is the function of energy. Right? Because of the neutron, we can have energy or mass, which is both the same thing. And what happens with mass, right? What happens when electrons, like the function of an electron is the function of entropy, which basically means that over time, through speed, of course, right, objects, they all dissipate away from each other. That's what entropy is. It's just the loss of energy in a way. It's a dissipation of it. So ultimately, energy mass, right? Energy equals mass. These 2 things dissipate through entropy. That's all that that's saying. So the translation religiously would be God created the heavens and the earth. Right now we have the first solid building block of matter. Now there are molecules, of course, to be added here, but there's a reason for why it's not included. Same thing with subatomic particles, so quarks, muons, gluons, all that kind of stuff, supersymmetry. And this is more philosophical. It's not really relevant in this presentation at the moment, but it has to do with spiralism or jumping continuity theory, which is the idea that if you're going to map the different levels of reality, the different illusions, or like this evolution, well, the range that you use is arbitrary. And so when you create a range or parameters, it's necessarily going to eliminate some of the levels, and to smooth those levels that are eliminated, you have the infinity in between. So That I know it makes no sense, very hard to understand, but the point is, it's just a statement for future reference and for people who can ask about it later. So that being said, I don't have molecules here yet. We will see. This is not completed. It's a work in progress. Um, but so the next part of the atom, when I say like it's the first fundamental block, yes, someone could say, well, no, there's subatomic particles. Very well understood. But for now, to understand that really we're trying to collapse everything here. The whole point is to realize that however precise you get with the levels, it doesn't really matter. They all collapse anyway. We know that superposition or subatomic particles come before the actual atom itself. But so what, right? It's all going to collapse anyway. Then we have the next thing. So atoms form molecules, and of course, molecules will form cells. Um, and so at this point, I'm not a biologist, but from what I understand, we have prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic are the ones that have DNA in the nucleus, and it's a lot more complex in a way. It's what allows human beings to exist. Prokaryotic only has DNA inside of a protein shell, I believe, and bacteria is the simplest form of life in a way. I think this is the unicellular life, and this is multicellular life on the right. And of course, the cell, the idea of a cell in general, is in the middle column. It's the unity, once again. And of course, that unity is what allows the tissue to emerge, and tissues create organs, organs create human beings. That being said, it's in the center column for that reason. It is the unity between bacteria and DNA in a sense, because bacteria is really, I mean, a massive amount of our gut, for example, is bacteria. It's like an ecosystem, and our whole bodies have trillions of bacteria. And of course, DNA is the instructions. It's the cells that carry the instructions as to how the body is going to function. So superpose those two, and you have the cell, and it starts to look a lot like it fits into this middle column here, right? Unity, once again, energy in general is unity that comes from a position, the absolute place, and that absolute place we have defined with our language as a state, as a being, as a potential, as a zero, as a tau, as a whatever. Um, so from the zero, you can get cells, and now we're starting to see a little bit more of a logical, linear understanding of that. That being said, um, the translation is God created the animals according to their kinds, and in biology we call this evolutionary theory. Then from cells, the next unity, the next level. So you start to understand here that this is a spiral, right? And on each level of the spiral, we have something new. And this is the present moment. This is us, right? The unity of you, right, which is the collection of cells and neutrons and atoms and all that, which is existing in a space, which is generated by thoughts, which is really generated by potential. This is where things technically should end. I mean, if we are a product of God's thoughts in a way, and if we continue thinking, we start to project, right? So family, when we procreate, we start to project into the future other units, more unity, right? We have families, we have societies, and so on. How far can that go? I mean, you could take it to collection of planets, galactic empires, and uh, maybe super galaxies or whatever, webs, quadrants in space, whatever. Then universe, and then multiverse. It just never ends. It never will end. But ultimately, it all has to lead back to awareness. That is the fundamental substrate for everything. So I haven't included awareness at the top yet, but you will see that ultimately awareness is the qualia about the nothingness, the absolute reality that generates everything. So all of this leads back to awareness. So anyway, so right now in the present moment, you are a human being that has thought, that has cognition. You are aware. You're aware that of the future and of the past, of life and death, and so on, of what came before you, what composes you, and what you compose. Um, so if you start to look backwards, you realize, so that would be up, you realize there's nothing. It's or everything at the same time, superposition of both, an infinity. And then you look forward, and it's the same thing. It's an infinity of reality, of existence, of lots of stuff. So the choice is yours. You can be God, you can realize enlightenment, and you can take part in this reality that it creates. So that's the present moment. So, of course, what do we have? The human is a combination or the superposition of a man and a woman. So, woman is a function of a female, man is the function of a male. I don't know if these two should be switched. Like, is male the function of a man? Maybe that's better, and female the function of a woman. In any case, a human is the function of the species. Yeah, I think this might have to be switched around. I don't know yet, because it could be that the species is a function of a human. A human serves the species, kind of. I don't know. These things are quite interchangeable a lot of the times. So what's the translation there? So God created man in his own image, right? Which is literally what we're seeing here. The reflection of all things is zero. It's nothingness. It's it's a unity of things. So when we say man, we say human. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. We already see there's like a symmetry of identity in the words themselves, right? Which refers to this idea that they're intrinsically connected. Male and female, he created them. So what we see as a duality, male and female, and this is the whole reason for a lot of esoteric sex cult practices, where there's copulation and it's being witnessed by like all these people. We've seen this in kind of like movies and fiction and that kind of sort of thing. Secret societies, the union of male and female. We have the Star of David, all that stuff. It all refers to this. So again, like I said, it doesn't matter how spiritual, religious, atheist, a combination of all of them, whatever. It's all here. It's all being unified. So what emerges from humans? Well, we have the family units. That's the next. That's why we say the nuclear family. And what is that? That is procreation, right? When we're talking about man and woman coming together, they procreate, they generate the species. That has to do with life and death, right? It wouldn't be boy and girl because that really is the same thing as female and male. It's life and death. So life is the function of death in the female column here, and death is the function of life. So in order for life to emerge, there has to be death. In evolutionary terms, that's really the cycle that we're talking about. The circle of life. Well, that's what it is, right? Lion King all the way. Okay, so life. There's a reason for why I put life as the function of death in the female category, and death is a function of life in the male category. And I know that's strange because they're opposites. It's a duality of opposites, and they're together in this cell. Cell. Uh, the male sperm is what generates life, right? It's the spark, but the female is what grows life. Like that's what like births life. So the input of life comes from male, and the output of life comes from female. So that's why like life or death is the function of life. So in a way, when a man ejaculates, it takes life away from him. I don't think it's a coincidence that tryptophan gets released in the brain and you just want to go to sleep and you feel more tired and all that, because there's a lot of nutrients that gets lost in male ejaculation. So in a way, it's like the death of the man, in a way, to generate life. So it's the function of life there. And the opposite with female, right? If life is the function of death, um, the woman's function, in a way, is to generate that life. So the man sparks the life. That's why that's the definition. And with a woman actually nurtures the life. That's the function of pregnancy. And so life is the function of death. Well, why? Why is it death? Because that child is going to grow up and die, and that's why we have strong religious symbolism between the mother and the child. It's the mother, like especially the sacrifice of Santa Maria or something like that. I forget exactly, but it's a famous statue in Christianity where Mother Mary is holding Christ as like his dead body in a way. It's the ultimate sacrifice. The woman has to literally nurture, bring life into this world, and then offer it to the world to get killed. Uh, so the ultimate suffering is probably that. In any case, you're starting to see how everything comes together. I give these little bits of culture and history and religion and science, so that we can see just how integrated all of this stuff is. So honor thy father and thy mother. It's what I've chosen for the religious translation. Why? Because it's not just about like listen to your parents. No, I believe that this is a deeper honor. It's to honor thy father and thy mother. It's to honor both, like the superposition of both, which is God. Honor the creation, honor the zero by generating, further generating everything that it's projecting outwards. So of course, love and sex, right? So honoring the mother father, the like I said, we said, right, the union between male and female, and continuing the cycle forward. That I believe is why the religion has that term. And again, so this is a projection. We're the ones who start to see that we have to come together and create union. That's more conscious. Like we're not strictly aware of. It's not like we use our awareness to combine all of ourselves together to create us. The same way that we're aware that we should live together as family units, right? We could very well not live that way and be a bit more like communistic and just live in communes. But even that is another form of union, right? You're just separating it in different ways. So unity is very difficult it's impossible to get rid of. There's always unity that happens. Things come together. The Pareto principle, for example, is a great example of that. I think it's 1/3 of all of the mass in the universe, or 2/3 of all the mass in the universe is held by 1/3 of all the planets. 2/3 of all the work in a corporation or in a company gets done by 1/3 of the employees. This occurs everywhere and in everything, which is also part of this spiral, which there's a pattern there of has to do with a third, meaning like the levels develop at a certain speed and distance, meaning like there's a third happening. That's why things get faster and faster, moving towards singularity as things get unionized. Anyway, so that's starting to go a bit further. The point is we're projecting the next unity here. That's why I've written projection. We're creating it. We're always creating. And the second thing we're projecting after the family unit is society and cities, right? So, we have society, which is composed of what? Citizens, individual citizens, and citizens come together to create groups or communities. And so the combination of the citizens and the groups creates a society, which is what creates a city. The society is a function of a city. Why? Because people are what really function and what move around in the cities. And the cities is like the physical framework for society. And of course, a citizen is the example or the definition of the people that exist in a society. That's why citizen is a function of people, and groups is the function of a community. Really, we're just reducing the meaning. So community is ultimately a grouping. So you create the superposition between both. You have society, and the translation there is for where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them, which is powerful because there it is again, the duality, triality. So there's a relationship between duality and triality. I haven't explained this yet in this video, but we're talking about a triune here. And like I said, duality is necessary to reach the synthesis of the third thing, which is really just one thing. So we have duality here, we have duality here, but we also, so the relationship, to be more visual, is a triangle necessarily has to have its base. You need two corners to create the third. So that's why this is quite remarkable when you hear this, for where two or three gather, right? Two or three, where they gather in my name, the piece of language, the logos, I am God, right? There I am with them. There I am. Like I said, there I am. We're talking up here, right? I am thinking, this is happening. I exist. So what is the translation of that, right? Economies, politics. When we gather together, when there's a group, when there's a community, there starts to be activity there. What are we grouping together for, right? there's a movement in between, and we regulate those movements. That's what politics are. It's kind of like the lifeblood of a society. So God is there in everything, in the groups or the totality. And of course, we can project further. We can only say, okay, after cities and societies, there'll be planetary, there'll be the global community or the global unit, and then there'll be like multiplanetary. We'll have colonized Mars and so on. This goes on forever. So ultimately, we have to stop somewhere to realize that at the end, we will reach a singularity, right? Where if all of these levels become aware, right, and that's what we're doing here with the triune, or all of sentience becomes aware, then it reaches a singularity. Everything moves faster and faster, which means that if you take Ray Kurzweil's view, he projects into the future so far that he says matter itself will become computational. It'll become aware. But what happens when everything in the universe becomes aware, right? It must collapse to nothingness, to zero. It'll collapse back to awareness. That's what it is. It's collapsing back. Um, and what happens at that collapse? It's pure potential, right? Will it stop? Will everything just, be destroyed forever? Or will there be a cycle? Will it just continue again? Will it project forward again? That's what we're going to see. Well, that's where we reach a certain paradox. Do things conclude or do they not conclude? That being said, let me take a piece or take some water here. The next level is awareness. Again, because we've got infinities here all the time, and multiple levels. There's always, maybe there are levels we're not even aware of. Like, is there a level between the human and the family units, right? Not that we can see. Maybe there's a level between, if we had added here subatomic particles, maybe there's something even more fundamental between subatomic particles and nothingness. Maybe we'll just generate one, right? That's what we seem to be doing with science, where like the Higgs boson, it didn't exist. We came up with the idea and then we looked for it and we found it. I mean, did we find it or do we generate it? This is the question, right? I'm not going to comment on that any further, but it should stick in your mind. That being said, ultimately, all these rows, all these levels, ultimately reach a singularity. Why? Because all of these rows are singularities, right? When enough cells come together, you have species, you have animals and human beings that can do things, that work as a unit. So what is a unit? It's a singularity, right? So ultimately, when all things become a singularity through technology is what you could say is really the hand of God, or the action of building. Then it'll return to awareness on the sides, right? Or if you look at it the other way, ultimately being aware of your awareness will lead to the singularity. Maybe it's both. So awareness is the function of awareness. You have you have an awareness, and the only access to freedom that you really have is to choose where you put that awareness. I'm quoting from Roy, who's given this triune system. So I'm coming from the paradoxical side. I'm the dual side. I use duality, and I've plugged in all the paradoxes into this triune, so as to explain things and create a pathway back into nothingness, or into the perfect state, and to show that this just continues on forever, so that you have a choice. And both seem to be happening simultaneously. That being said, we have awareness is the function of awareness. I mean, it's the same thing. If you're aware that you have an awareness, you can do something about it. You can choose to stay aware and to generate the world, or operate in the world, or you can choose to just be aware. And the more you do that, the more you're just sitting in the pure potential at the top. So ultimately, samsara is the cycle. That's the Hindu term for this the cycle of this whole thing. So it's the reset ultimately. Another thing that Roy contributed. So this triune and this axiom, this is happening, is the dual counterpart of the cogito ergo sum. So I call it Roy's axiom. So Roy basically came up with the triune system, the this axiom of this is happening, and that ultimately, and as well the third thing, of course, it all happens in threes, is the number system. Like what does it mean that we go up to 9? Now in human history we have multiple number systems. They don't all function this way, in a way. But one thing that seems to happen with all the number systems is that they reset somehow. It's not like linear. You don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, another symbol, another symbol, another symbol. You tend to have to reset so that you can group things, create unity all over again. Imagine if you didn't have 10, 1, 0, right? How would you create 20 and 30? The concept of 30 would be very difficult to arrive at. You would have to create symbols to achieve 30. So it's better to just reset everything. So that idea of the 9 to 10 reset is also Roy's contribution, which allows you to see the collapse of everything and see what happens. What happens is a reset. After a certain amount of time, we just reset everything, and that's what samsara is, right? We go back to 0, right? So that we can have 1 again. And so we're skipping over the nothingness, which isn't even 0. We can't even describe it, right? So ultimately, the whole reason that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or all those levels, that's described by JCT or Spiralism. JCT stands for jumping continuity theory. That's the technical term. Spiralism is the name. Function and definition. So everything that gets explained here, it's predictive, and that would be Daniel's contribution. Not only does it predict the levels and explains like how fast they happen, but it also dives into each infinity that gets generated on those levels. So it starts to he's looking into understanding how it unravels and what else there is to gain like information about those levels. So really massive work. It's being done by a couple of other people as well. Tyler Goldstein, for example, with his sentient singularity. Everything is starting to converge. There's a lot of people being aware of a lot of these axioms and a lot of these truths. And unity theory seems to try to create the logos or the name for it all, try to get the view of it all. So unity, even my theory, which is paradoxism, it's incomplete, it's more complex, and so is the predictive theories, which are the description of all these levels. They're all very ecumenical, they're all encompassing, but they're also all incomplete. And in order to complete these theories of everything, it requires its self-description, and that's what unity theory does. Okay, so now that we're at the cycle, the question is, does it continue or does it collapse? Like, will the singularity, which is predicted by different people at different times. Some people say in a couple hundred years, some people say in 40 years, less than 40 years. There's really no accurate time. And what happens to that singularity? Will it just create another unit that we're not aware of or we can't imagine exactly? Or will everything collapse and existence will cease? And if existence were to cease, would the zero potential just project everything outwards again? Or does it only just do it once somehow? This is the conclusion paradox, right? Because this cycle, does it conclude when we reach singularity, or does it go on forever? There's two views there, and ultimately that is the real paradox that is unsolvable. It's like the one truth that God will never reveal until you've transcended your human state. So once you're dead, maybe that's something you'll know. But ultimately you are God, but you also play the limited aspect that God is projecting as a human being. And this seems to be the ultimate truth that you're not meant to know, because it's not relevant to you. That's not your function. So dogmatism is still possible here. People can use unity theory and bash others over the head and say this is the truth or this is the pathway to truth, the best pathway, and that would be entirely wrong. It would be antithetical to what unity theory is all about. It's about unity. It's about reconciling all these things. So when it comes to the conclusion paradox, be very careful, because you can understand everything, but it doesn't mean you know everything. The moment someone asks you, "What am I thinking?" right? Or what's the chemical composition of planet XYZ in this nebula or whatever? You don't know that. You can't actually know everything. You can understand everything, meaning you understand the essence of everything, but you also have a part to play. You don't know everything. So ultimately, the one thing that no one knows ever, no matter how enlightened you are, is is does God conclude the game, or does he continue playing it? Um, you know, the Buddhists have an interesting view about that. They have a saying, which is, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, because if you think you've reached enlightenment, you're done. You're actually not enlightened. You're starting to go back down again. There is, the enlightenment never finishes. It's also infinite potential. So there's no reason or purpose to think that you're enlightened. Even that's also going too far. Just be, right? Don't speak. So this is the problem between religions and enlightened people. Like the closer you are to enlightenment, or the more you are on the enlightenment path, let's say, because it never finishes, the more your ego can get inflated, which is ironic, because enlightenment is all about dissolving your ego to really be everything. And so you vacillate between being everything and thinking that you are everything as the limited person that you are. So that's where God complex comes in. So humility is really the way forward. I like to say, like, be silent when you want to be God, and speak only when you need to be man, right? And recognize that you're a man in that moment when you're speaking. So that's why you wouldn't say uh, things like "I am God." You can say it because you are, but you have to be very careful, very, very careful. All right. So, what are the implications that emerge from this theory? The first one is obviously that it unifies physics, metaphysics, science, Eastern and Western religion. It really unifies everything. It renders everything compatible, which basically leads to the second thing. So, I should really switch these two around. There is no such thing as false. There can't be two separate fundamental truths, right? That's what the whole point of a fundamental truth is. Like, it can only be one, no matter what it is. Therefore, whatever exists in the single fundamental truth is true. The contradictions that we experience, they're only illusory, right? They're different perspectives, and we understand them as contradictions and that they can't both be. But on the highest level of abstraction, it actually generated the possibility for that to happen. So it's true. So, someone can believe in wizards and witches, and others can believe in different gods and whatever. It's ultimately all just a hook into the oneness, right? They're just more limited. Um, they're using thoughts to achieve it, and that just leads you away from it. That's why, like, meditation is meditation. But on the other side, if you're an enlightened being, like, there's a lot of gurus that are in the simplicity column, right? So I explained that earlier. As the observer, if you're in the simplicity column, you're going to say to others, like, well, this is how it is, and you should, accept it. But you have to experience it for yourself. It doesn't matter how much you go and visit India and China and all that or Nepal. They're just gonna, like, a real master would just sit there in front of you and say nothing until you've either lost your patience and you go, or you actually start to learn what he's talking about. You got to actually just be like, he's showing you by example in the best way possible. He's saying nothing, he or she. So that's where the people in the complexity, so the religions that start to describe all these little things in all these little ways, and the simplicity, we're just sort of sitting there. They're both not exact, right? Like, the actuality lies in between. When it comes to a unifying theory of everything, if you want to define everything, you want to lead a pathway for people to get there, it's going to be a balance. So this balance is also incomplete, right? This is really, even unity theory is not the perfect unity. I mean, like, it's it's something you have to recognize. Okay, another thing that emerges as an implication is that the reason quantum mechanics can't be resolved with classical physics is that there's no definite space and time. It's constantly being created by the observer, like I said before. That's a massive implication. That ties together a lot of different things. And, one of the implications that I haven't mentioned here is that a theory of everything, so an understanding of everything, is ultimately not just a symbol or an idea or a pathway, it's a technology. It would be applicable not just to yourself to achieve zero, but it could be applicable to how you generate reality. And so it's a very, very powerful / dangerous technology as well. It can be applied on each level, right? This is something that is a bit further, but to give you a little taste of what I believe how it would work, it would be that because zero is perfection and the state is the state, the inputs and outputs, right? So this is the column of input plus, it's generative, and this is output, you know, axioms. Or it could be the other way around. Again, it doesn't really matter, plus and minus. We think about it as plus or like generative and subtractive, but really they're both the same thing. The point is output and input are the same thing as well. So if you choose an output, meaning this is what you're trying to achieve, you will necessarily generate inputs that will allow you to, they'll try to make you lead to that output. You want a certain result, but that's the error right there. You should not define an output. The system has the output and the input at the same time, which is why you have to be in the present moment. All decisions get made for you in a way as life moves through you. You don't move through life through space and time because it doesn't exist. The truth sort of passes through you, and the choice gets presented to you, and you'll know which one has to happen. So if you can apply that to like quantum mechanics or other things, it may be revolutionary. I don't know, but that's a very, very brief overview, and it's not developed, and it may be complete bull. So that's that. And there's more to read here, which you can just read it yourselves in the documents that I'll post. And this is going to be updated as well because it's not perfect. But there it is. That's the introduction to the triune, or the semantic definition and translation charts to the triune, because the triune ultimately is it's a symbol. I mean, we start with the symbol. It's the simplest way. It's that. So unity theory, well, any kind of unification theory has to have a few things. It has to reconcile math, physics, philosophy, religion, consciousness. All of this has to come together. It has to reconcile all things. Metaphysics, right? It can't just be reconciling quantum mechanics and classical physics. I mean, it's got to. Well, the reason you can't reconcile them, like I said, is no space-time. But I believe. But you need a symbol. So all of that unification needs a symbol to tie it all together. And that's why the triangle is so universal. That's why the circle is so universal, because these symbols really do represent everything with a piece of language as far as we can describe things. So we have a symbol, we have a unification of all the geometry, math, physics, and philosophy and consciousness and spirituality. And I think that's it. And then, of course, we have the predictive theory, the spiral, which is Daniel's area of expertise. And I can't describe all of that right now. But I can do a beginning, kind of. No, I won't explain it here. So that's what it is. Thanks for listening. And let me see, how do I go back to here? There we go. An hour and 10 minutes. That's perfect. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or you want to be briefed on some other things, just reach out.